Hey, Daniel here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a fifth-year undergraduate student at the University of British Columbia and also an undergraduate teaching assistant in the Department of Political Science. We're just past halfway into the term, and now that midterms are done, I've been getting a lot of questions from students about term papers, how to write them, and more specifically, how to get started on them. So while I'm in that headspace, I figured I might as well share a few tips on how to write an undergraduate research paper. These tips are based on what I've heard from teaching assistants, professors, feedback from undergraduate journals over the years, and while they might be general in nature, I do want to emphasize that they might be focused more on political science and international relations. With that having been said, regardless of which academic discipline you belong to, I'm thinking some of these introductory techniques might be useful. So I think a good place to start would be to go over what the writing process actually looks like. And for me, that takes place in 6 steps. First is topic selection. Second is pre-reading, brainstorming, kind of getting a feel of the topic itself. Third would be actually sitting down to do the research. Fourth would be writing. Fifth would be revising, editing. And sixth, the last step, would be to submit the paper. Now, because the paper writing process is so complex, I think what I'm going to do is focus specifically where I think a lot of students have difficulty, which is actually starting the paper. So if you go back to those 6 steps I talked about earlier, the first is topic selection. Generally, at the undergraduate level, there are a couple ways that professors will give you topics to write about. First is they might give you an open prompt. So that means they'll either let you choose the topic on your own, or they'll give you a general hint such as democracy, or populism, or social media. And while general, these topics are ones that you'll want to refine and make more specific throughout the paper writing process. The alternative to the open prompt would be to give you a closed prompt. So these are more specific questions that detail basically how the professor wants you to go over the topic. An example of this would be to say, does the UN's responsibility to protect doctrine justify the invasion of national sovereignty? How you choose your topic is completely up to you. There are a couple ways that students might go about it. First would be if they have a particular geographic preference. So if there's a country or region that they're specifically interested in, that's one way to go about it. If you're also interested in a specific conflict or issue, that's another way to go about it. And I guess another way to go about it is to look at the research paper as an opportunity to learn more about a subject that you haven't learned about before. Ultimately, your choice of topic is really a function of your interests, your background knowledge, and basically your own personal preference. Okay, so I've chosen my topic, now what? That is where I would suggest something called pre-reading. Essentially what I mean by this is exposing yourself to literature on the topic before you actually sit down to write or figure out what your thesis is going to be. This can look like readings on the topic at large, like environmentalism or populism or social media and democracy, or you can look at specific key terms, for example, the responsibility to protect or the nationality trap. Arguably, pre-reading is more useful for the open prompt questions since it allows you to narrow down what your topic is going to be. But again, it is really useful just to get a feel for how the debate is going, even if you're looking at a closed prompt question. In terms of what you're actually going to read, these can include newspapers, books, academic journal articles, encyclopedia articles. Whichever material you choose to read is completely up to you, since at this point you're focused more on trying to familiarize yourself with the topic. Overall, there are several reasons why you might want to engage in pre-reading. The first would be, quite simply, it allows you to find sources that you're going to cite later on. It also allows you to familiarize yourself with key concepts or key terms that maybe you haven't heard before, figuring out what they mean, how they're used, etc. And on a similar vein, it lets you familiarize yourself with the topic itself. What are the ongoing debates? What have scholars said about it? And that way you can insert yourself into those debates to make sure that your research is up to date and relevant. But I guess if you take a step back, the most important reason would be simply to develop an opinion on the topic. One of the biggest problems that students face is they approach a topic without actually having anything to say. So in this sense, pre-reading can give you a kind of a basis on which to build your argument. So again, as I said, this pre-reading component tends to be more useful for the open prompt questions since it lets you narrow down what you're writing about to something really specific, but you can still use it when it comes to the closed prompt questions. The only difference with the closed prompt questions is that you already kind of have a framework set out for you if you break down the question. Let me give you a quick example of this. The first undergraduate paper that I wrote for political science had the following closed prompt question. Does the principle of the responsibility to protect, as defined by the United Nations, justify the international community violating national sovereignty and intervening in Syria in light of the use of chemical weapons. So if I try and break down this question, there are 3 identifiable sections that I can use as a framework for my paper. First would be to look at the principle of the responsibility to protect. What is that? What does it mean? How is it used? What are its origins? Those kinds of questions. Now, following the question verbatim, the next section I might want to choose is to talk about sovereignty. What is sovereignty? What are its origins? How might it be violated, as the question suggests? So at that point, I can say to myself, okay, now that I know what the responsibility to protect is, and now that I know what sovereignty is and when it can be violated, the logical follow-up would be, does the use of chemical weapons allow the violation of national sovereignty under the responsibility to protect doctrine? Does that kind of make sense? So in essence, all we're doing here is just breaking down the question to find the key terms, key components that we'll use to framework the paper itself. And if we're going to go back to pre-reading, these are the sort of things you'd want to pre-read on. So yeah, that's pretty much all I had to say when it comes to topic selection and pre-reading, just to get you over that first hurdle of actually sitting down to start the paper. If you have any questions, if there's anything that's kind of unclear, or even if there's any other content you want me to cover, do let me know in the comments below. Otherwise, if you found it useful, feel free to give it a like, maybe a subscribe, and I'll see you next time.